All 7 of us are yours." The words echoed in Judson Pryor's mind as he stared at the young woman standing in his doorway, her dress torn and dirt-stained, yet her green eyes burning with desperate determination. Behind her, 6 smaller figures huddled in the shadows like frightened animals, their faces gaunt with hunger and fear. The eldest couldn't be more than 19, but she spoke with the authority of someone who had been making life-or-death decisions for far too long. Judson had found his neighbor Samuel Boone's body just 3 days ago, face down in the creek that separated their properties. The old man had been healthy as a horse, working his land every dawn until dusk. But there he was, stone cold, with no marks of violence, no signs of struggle, just dead. The strangest part wasn't the death itself, but what Judson had found clutched in Samuel's rigid fingers. A crumpled piece of paper with 7 names written in shaking handwriting. And at the bottom, 2 words that made no sense at all. He knows. Now here stood Tessa Boone, Samuel's eldest daughter, offering herself and her 6 sisters to a man she barely knew. Her proposal was simple and terrifying. Marriage, all of them, in exchange for protection and survival. But Judson could see something else in her eyes, something that made his skin crawl with unease. She wasn't just desperate. She was afraid. Not of starvation, not of the wilderness, but of something specific. Something she kept glancing toward the tree line to watch for. The rules of the frontier were harsh but clear. A man protected what was his, and what wasn't his problem. Judson had lived by that code for 34 years. But as Tessa stepped closer, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper, she said something that shattered everything he thought he understood about his neighbor's death. Something about why Samuel had really died, and why someone had been watching Judson's ranch for the past 2 nights. The piece of paper in his pocket suddenly felt like it was burning through the fabric. And for the first time in his adult life, Judson Pryor realized he might be completely out of his depth. Judson had never seen a woman look so beautiful and so dangerous at the same time. Tessa Boone stood in his doorway like she owned the place, her auburn hair catching the morning light despite being unwashed for days. The contrast between her refined features and the desperation in her voice created a tension that made his chest tight. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. 3 days earlier, his biggest worry had been whether the creek would dry up before autumn. Now he was staring at 7 orphans who needed food, shelter, and protection he wasn't equipped to provide. Behind Tessa, the younger girls pressed together like a litter of abandoned kittens. The smallest couldn't be older than 6, her thumb firmly planted in her mouth as she peered around her sister's skirt. The others ranged in age, but they all shared the same hollow-eyed look of children who had seen too much too soon. Judson stepped back from the doorway, running a calloused hand through his graying hair. His ranch was built for one man living alone. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a main room that doubled as everything else. The barn could house the girls temporarily, but winter was coming, and even the strongest adults struggled to survive the mountain cold. 7 extra mouths to feed would drain his supplies before the snow melted. More importantly, taking in Samuel's daughters would make him responsible for their futures, their marriages, their entire lives. That wasn't a burden he had ever wanted. But as Tessa stepped fully into his home without invitation, her eyes scanning the space with calculating precision, Judson realized she wasn't asking for charity. She was negotiating. Her fingers traced the edge of his wooden table, testing its sturdiness, and she nodded approvingly at the well-stocked pantry visible through the kitchen doorway. When she turned back to face him, her expression had shifted from desperation to something closer to business arrangement. "You're thinking this is too much trouble," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough steel to remind him that Samuel Boone had raised no weaklings. "You're thinking 7 girls will eat you out of house and home, 'cause nothing but problems, and give you headaches you don't need." She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the wood smoke in her hair and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "But you're also thinking about what I said about someone watching your place, about what Papa really knew before he died." The paper in Judson's pocket seemed to crackle as she spoke. Samuel's death had been strange enough to keep him awake at night, but the mysterious watchers Tessa mentioned made everything worse. If she was telling the truth, then taking in the Boone girls might not be charity at all. It might be survival. The problem was figuring out whether Tessa Boone was his salvation or the most beautiful trap he had ever walked into. "There's something else," Tessa whispered, glancing toward the window where the morning shadows stretched long across his property. Something Papa found out about why our land was really worth killing for. And now they think you know it too. The words hit Judson like a physical blow. He had assumed Samuel's death was natural, maybe a weak heart or bad fall. But Tessa was talking about murder, about land worth killing for, about mysterious watchers who thought Judson possessed dangerous knowledge. His mind raced back to the past month, searching for anything unusual, any conversation or encounter that might explain why someone would want him dead. "You're scaring the little ones," he said finally, nodding toward the cluster of girls still huddled by the door. The youngest had started to whimper, sensing the adult tension even if she couldn't understand the words. Tessa's expression softened immediately, and she knelt to gather the child into her arms, whispering gentle reassurances that everything would be fine. The transformation was remarkable. One moment she was a hardened negotiator, the next a tender mother figure who could calm fears with a simple touch. But Judson noticed how her eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking the windows and doorway even while comforting her sister. Whatever threat she feared was real enough to keep her in a state of permanent alertness. That level of vigilance didn't come from imagination or female hysteria. It came from experience with genuine danger. "Tell me about the land," Judson said quietly, settling into his chair and gesturing for the girls to make themselves comfortable. The older ones immediately began organizing their siblings, finding seats and sharing what little food they carried in their worn bags. Their efficiency suggested this wasn't the first time they had been refugees, and Judson wondered how long they had been running. Tessa remained standing, positioning herself where she could see both the front door and the window facing the creek. "Papa found something 3 weeks ago. He wouldn't tell me what, but he started acting different, nervous. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I should come to you first. Said you were the only neighbor he trusted." She paused, studying Judson's face for his reaction. "He also said you had a right to know because it concerned your property too." The piece of paper in Judson's pocket suddenly felt heavier. 7 names and the cryptic message, "He knows." If Samuel had been killed for discovering something valuable, then whoever did it might believe Judson was a co-conspirator. That would explain the mysterious watchers Tessa mentioned. But it also meant that taking in the Boone girls wouldn't just be an act of charity. It would be a declaration of war against whoever had killed their father. Judson looked around his small, peaceful home. The afternoon light streaming through the windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, and the only sounds were the soft murmur of the girls sharing dried biscuits and the distant lowing of cattle. It was exactly the quiet life he had worked 30 years to build. But as he watched Tessa's eyes flick nervously toward the tree line again, he realized that quiet life might already be over. "How long do you think we have before they come looking for you here?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Somewhere in the past few minutes, he had stopped thinking about whether to help the Boone girls and started thinking about how to keep them all alive. Tessa's face went pale at the question, and for the first time since arriving, her composure cracked. "They came to our place yesterday morning. 3 men on horseback asking questions about Papa's last days. When I told them he had died natural, they wanted to search the house." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That's when I knew we had to run." Judson felt his stomach tighten. If armed men were conducting searches, then whatever Samuel had discovered was valuable enough to kill for and important enough to risk exposure. The smart thing would be to turn the girls away, send them to the territorial authorities, and pretend this conversation never happened. But as he watched the youngest Boone girl curl up against Tessa's side, her small face trusting and peaceful for the first time all day, he realized he was already too deep to back out. "Did they find what they were looking for?" he asked, though something in Tessa's expression told him the answer would complicate everything. "No," she said, reaching into the folds of her torn dress, "because Papa gave it to me the night before he died." She pulled out a small leather pouch, no bigger than her palm, and set it carefully on Judson's table. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, and when she loosened the drawstring, the contents caught the afternoon light like captured fire. Gold. Not nuggets or dust, but refined pieces that had been worked by skilled hands. Judson had seen enough raw gold from prospectors passing through to know the difference. This wasn't something Samuel had panned from the creek. This was crafted jewelry, coins from distant places, and small ingots that spoke of established mines and serious money. The kind of wealth that could buy land, politicians, or silence. "Papa found this buried near the old oak by the creek," Tessa continued, her fingers hovering protectively over the treasure. "But that's not the important part. The important part is what else he found buried with it. She glanced toward her sisters, making sure they were occupied with their meager meal, then leaned closer to Judson. Maps, land surveys, and papers showing that our creek doesn't just mark the boundary between our properties. It runs directly through the richest gold vein this territory has ever seen. The implications hit Judson like a landslide. If the surveys were accurate, then both the Boone property and his own ranch sat on top of a fortune that would attract every greedy prospector, corrupt official, and dangerous man within 500 miles. Samuel's death wasn't random violence. It was the opening move in what would become a war over the richest claim in the mountains. The men who came yesterday, Judson said slowly, his mind racing through the possibilities. Did you recognize any of them? Tessa nodded grimly. The leader was Marcus Finn. He runs the Territorial Land Office. She paused, letting the significance sink in. Which means this isn't just about gold anymore. It's about who controls the legal right to mine it. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley, growing steadily louder. The hoofbeats were close enough now to count. 3 horses, approaching fast but not at a full gallop. Judson's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle mounted above his fireplace, but Tessa caught his wrist with surprising strength. Her touch sent an unexpected jolt through him. Warm and electric, even in the midst of their fear. If you fight them now, they'll know you're involved, she whispered urgently. We need to hide the girls first. Her fingers remained on his arm. And despite everything, Judson found himself acutely aware of how small her hand looked against his weathered skin. This wasn't the time for such thoughts, but her proximity was making it difficult to think clearly about anything else. The younger Boone girls had gone silent at the sound of approaching riders, their faces turning toward Tessa with the automatic deference of children who had learned to follow orders without question. She gestured toward the back of the house and they moved like shadows, disappearing into the smaller bedroom with an efficiency that spoke of practiced terror. Only Tessa remained, quickly stuffing the gold and papers back into the leather pouch. There's a loose board under my bed, Judson said quietly. Hide it there. As she hurried toward his bedroom, he tried not to think about how right it looked to see her moving through his private space, touching his belongings, making herself at home in rooms where no woman had set foot in over a decade. The riders pulled up outside with the harsh jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Through the window, Judson could see 3 men dismounting, their movements casual but alert. The leader was tall and expensively dressed, his boots polished despite the dusty ride. Marcus Finn, exactly as Tessa had described him. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle, their hands resting near their weapons with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence. Judson opened the door before they could knock, stepping onto his porch with the studied calm of a man who had nothing to hide. Afternoon, gentlemen. What brings you out my way? Marcus Finn smiled, but his eyes remained cold as winter creek water. Mr. Pryor, isn't it? We're investigating the unfortunate death of your neighbor, Samuel Boone. Just want to ask a few questions about your last conversation with him. Didn't have many conversations with Samuel, Judson replied truthfully. We were neighbors, not friends. Nodded when we passed. Helped each other with strayed cattle, but that was about it. Interesting, Finn said, pulling out a small notebook, because according to our information, Samuel visited your property the day before he died. Stayed for several hours. The man's smile never wavered, but his voice carried the subtle threat of someone who knew he was lying. Perhaps your memory needs refreshing. Behind him, Judson could hear the soft sound of Tessa returning from his bedroom, her footsteps carefully silent. The knowledge that she was listening to every word, trusting him to protect her and her sisters, filled him with a fierce determination he hadn't felt in years. Whatever Samuel Boone had discovered, whatever danger these men represented, Judson was done running from it. My memory's fine, he said evenly. Samuel never set foot on my land the day before he died. It was a dangerous lie. But as he spoke the words, Judson realized he had just chosen sides in a war he barely understood. Marcus Finn's smile widened, and Judson felt his stomach drop. The man reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small silver object that glinted in the afternoon sun. It was Samuel's pocket watch, the one the old man never went anywhere without. Judson had seen him check it dozens of times during their brief encounters over the years. Funny thing about this watch, Finn said casually, turning it over in his palm. We found it caught on a fence post at the edge of your property. The very fence that separates your land from the creek where poor Samuel died. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Now, how do you suppose it got there if Samuel never set foot on your land? The lie crumbled before Judson could even attempt to salvage it. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. And behind him, he sensed rather than heard Tessa's sharp intake of breath. She had risked everything by bringing her sisters here, trusting that he could protect them, and he had already failed at the first test. Maybe he dropped it while checking his cattle, Judson said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. Samuel had been too careful with that watch to simply lose it, and everyone in the territory knew it. Or maybe, Finn continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, he came here to discuss something important, something valuable, something that might have made certain people very nervous about what he knew. One of Finn's companions shifted slightly, his hand moving closer to his gun belt. The message was clear. This conversation could turn violent very quickly. Judson weighed his options. He could continue lying, but Finn obviously had more evidence than just the watch. He could tell the truth about Samuel's visit, but that would only confirm Finn's suspicions and put the girls in immediate danger. Or he could do something that might buy them time, even if it meant gambling with all their lives. "You're right," Judson said finally. "Samuel did come by, but not the day before he died. It was 3 days earlier. He wanted to discuss water rights for the creek, said he was thinking about expanding his cattle operation. It was a partial truth wrapped in misdirection, close enough to believable that Finn might accept it without digging deeper. But as the words hung in the air, Judson realized his mistake. Behind Finn, one of the hired guns was studying the ground near the porch with the focused attention of a professional tracker. The man knelt down, examining something in the dirt, then looked up at his boss with a meaningful nod. "Interesting," Finn said, his tone now openly mocking. "Because according to my friend here, there are fresh footprints from this morning, small ones, women's shoes." He gestured toward the tracks that Tessa and her sisters had left when they arrived. 7 sets, to be precise. Now, unless you've suddenly taken up entertaining large groups of ladies, I'd say you have some unexpected guests inside your house. The pretense was over. Finn knew exactly who was hiding inside, and Judson's lies had only made everything worse. As the territorial official took a step toward the front door, Judson moved to block his path, knowing that his next decision would determine whether any of them lived to see sunset. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Judson could see the calculation in Marcus Finn's eyes, weighing the risks of forcing his way past a determined rancher on his own property. The 2 hired guns flanked their boss, hands hovering near their weapons, but neither seemed eager to draw first. This far from town, gunshots would echo for miles, and dead bodies required explanations that might prove inconvenient for a territorial official. "I'm not looking for trouble, Prairie," Finn said finally, his tone shifting to something resembling reasonableness. "I just want to ask the Boone girls a few questions about their father's final days. Surely you can understand that." "I understand that children who just lost their father deserve to grieve in peace," Judson replied, not moving from his position in the doorway. "And I understand that armed men showing up asking questions tends to frighten them." Behind him, the door opened softly, and Tessa stepped onto the porch. Judson's heart hammered as she moved to stand beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. She had changed from her torn traveling dress into something clean she must have found in his bedroom. And despite everything, he found himself momentarily distracted by how the simple blue fabric brought out the green in her eyes. "You can ask your questions from there," Tessa said, her voice steady but wary. "My sisters have been through enough without strange men invading their temporary shelter." Finn's attention shifted to her with predatory focus. "Miss Boone, my condolences on your loss. I'm sure your father was a good man who simply found himself in over his head." He paused, studying her face for any reaction to the subtle threat. "These mountains can be dangerous for people who don't understand the complexities of territorial law. Claims get disputed, boundaries get contested. Sometimes good people get caught in the middle of situations they didn't create." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Tessa asked, though Judson could hear the slight tremor in her voice that revealed her fear. "I'm suggesting that certain discoveries on your father's property might be better off in the hands of people who know how to handle them properly. The territorial government has resources and expertise that simple farmers lack." Finn's smile never wavered, but his words carried unmistakable menace. Of course, if such discoveries were to disappear or be hidden from proper authorities, that would be a serious crime, one that could result in forfeiture of land rights. Criminal charges, even imprisonment. The threat was clear now. Hand over whatever Samuel had found, or face trumped-up charges that would leave the girls homeless and possibly separated. Judson felt Tessa's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but grip firm. The simple contact sent electricity up his arm, and he realized with startling clarity that somewhere in the past few hours, protecting this woman and her sisters had become more important to him than his own safety. "You have until tomorrow morning to consider my offer," Finn continued, remounting his horse. "After that, I'll be forced to take official action. And Miss Boone," he tipped his hat mockingly, "I do hope you make the wise choice. For everyone's sake." As the three men rode away, Judson squeezed Tessa's hand, wondering if he had just sealed all their death warrants. As soon as Finn's riders disappeared over the ridge, Judson pulled Tessa inside and bolted the door. The 6 younger Boone girls emerged from the back room like frightened deer, their faces pale and eyes wide with the understanding that their brief sanctuary was about to end. The youngest still clutched her doll, but even she seemed to sense the gravity of their situation. "We have to run," Tessa said immediately, already moving toward the bedroom where she had hidden the gold. "Tonight, before they come back with more men, we can make it to the territorial capital, file official claims, get protection from the federal authorities." But Judson caught her arm as she passed, spinning her around to face him. The contact sent that same electric shock through him, and this time he didn't try to ignore it. Looking down into her green eyes, he realized that losing her would be worse than losing his ranch, his freedom, or even his life. Somewhere between this morning's desperate proposal and this afternoon's shared danger, Tessa Boone had become essential to him in a way that defied logic or caution. "Running won't solve this," he said quietly. "Finn has resources, connections, and the law on his side. He'll track you down within a week, and next time there won't be any negotiations." His hands moved to frame her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "But there's another way, a permanent way." Tessa's breath caught at his touch, and for a moment the frightened refugee disappeared, replaced by a woman who saw exactly what he was offering. "You're talking about marriage," she whispered. "Real marriage, not just protection." "I'm talking about making you and your sisters legally mine," Judson replied, his voice rough with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. "Finn can't threaten my wife or my children. He can't steal my property or make claims on land that belongs to my family." He paused, searching her face for any sign of revulsion or fear. "But it has to be real, Tessa, not just papers and legal arrangements. I won't take a wife who's only staying out of gratitude or desperation." The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and risk. Around them, the younger girls watched with the solemn attention of children who understood that their futures hung in the balance of this conversation. Outside, the afternoon light was fading toward evening, and somewhere in the distance, Marcus Finn was preparing for tomorrow's confrontation. Finally, Tessa stepped closer, close enough that he could feel her breath against his chest. Her hands came up to rest on his shoulders, and when she looked up at him, her eyes held something deeper than gratitude or fear. "What about love?" she asked softly. "What happens when legal protection isn't enough anymore?" Judson's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized she wasn't rejecting his proposal. She was asking him to make it complete. "Then we'll figure that out as we go," he said, lowering his head until his forehead rested against hers. "But first we have to survive tomorrow. And for that, I need you to trust me completely." Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats filled the evening air again. But this time, instead of 3 riders, Judson counted at least 6 horses moving fast across his property. Finn had returned early, and he had brought reinforcements. Judson moved quickly to the window, counting the riders silhouetted against the darkening sky. 6 men, all armed, surrounding his property like a military operation. But as they drew closer, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken with hope, rather than fear. The lead rider wasn't Marcus Finn. It was Sheriff William Hayes from the territorial capital, and the star on his chest caught the last rays of sunlight. "Stay back," Judson told Tessa, but she was already beside him, her hand gripping his arm as they watched the sheriff dismount. "Judson Prairie," Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of genuine law rather than Finn's corrupt threats. "I need to speak with you about Marcus Finn and some irregularities in territorial land claims. Mind if we come in?" Relief flooded through Judson as he opened the door. Behind Hayes, 2 of the riders wore federal marshal badges, and the others were clearly legitimate deputies. "Sheriff Hayes, What brings you out this way? Got a telegraph yesterday from the territorial governor, Hayes replied, removing his hat as he entered. His eyes took in the scene quickly. Judson, Tessa, and the cluster of young girls, all obviously frightened but trying to appear calm. Seems there have been some complaints about unauthorized land seizures and suspicious deaths in this district. Marcus Finn's name came up several times. Tessa stepped forward, her chin raised with newfound courage. Sheriff, I'm Tessa Boone. My father Samuel died 3 days ago, and Mr. Finn has been threatening my family ever since. He wants us to hand over something my father found, and he's using his position to intimidate us. Hayes nodded grimly. That matches what we've heard from other families in the territory. Finn's been running a land grab operation, using his position to identify valuable claims and then forcing owners off their property through legal threats and mysterious accidents. He paused, studying Judson's face. The good news is that his authority has been suspended pending investigation. The bad news is that he's desperate enough to try one last score before we arrest him. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a single horse approached rapidly. Through the window they could see Marcus Finn riding hard toward the house,